Walk through almost any Canadian mall over the last few years, and you watched the same slow funeral. The video game store, EB Games, the one you grew up wandering, where you'd trade in a stack of old discs for store credit and blow it in the same visit, was supposed to be a dead man walking. Downloads had killed the disc. The internet had killed the trade-in, and to finish the job, the American company that owned it peeled the red and white name off the door and bolted its own one up instead. Now, sit with the math. A boardroom in Grapevine, Texas paid $1.5 billion to own this chain, then spent 20 years treating it like a rounding error on a spreadsheet, and spent even more money just to erase its Canadian name. Then, in 2025, it gave up and sold the whole thing off. And the new owner's very first move was to screw that old red and white sign right back onto 200 storefronts across the country. Because a Canadian wrote the check, the Americans wouldn't. So here's the question, worth the next 18 minutes of your time. How does a store left for dead in the one retail category everyone agrees is dying come back to life? By becoming more Canadian, not less. And the man who pulled it off had never sold a single video game in his life. Think about what actually survives in physical retail now. Dollarama works because a price tag in your hand gives you a certainty an online listing never can. The shops that live are the ones selling something you have a real reason to stand in front of in person. And by that test, a video game store should have died years ago because the modern video game isn't an object at all. It's a file. It lives on a server. PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo built the storefront straight into the console, so the player downloads the game directly, and every middleman in between simply disappears. The disc went from the only way to play to an optional piece of plastic most people never pick. So how did a chain built on selling that plastic not only survive, but come back? For that, you go back almost 50 years. The story doesn't start with games at all. It starts in 1977 with one small stand in a Pennsylvania mall called King of Prussia, run by a man named James Kim. He wasn't selling fun, he was selling gadgets, calculators, radios, digital watches, the kind of small electronics that felt like the future at the time. He called the little business Electronics Boutique. When the home console boom hit through the late 80s and early 90s, the Nintendo and Super Nintendo years, the company moved fast. It gutted the old product line and pointed the entire business at video games and computer software. And by the mid-90s, it was pushing north across the Canadian border, locking into suburban malls quicker than any bigger retailer could react. The department stores were still figuring out how to stock a gaming shelf, while Electronics Boutique was already in every major province. In 2002, the company dropped the formal name and took on the acronym its customers were already using, EB Games. Red and white, tucked into the mall somewhere between the food court and the shoe store. And if you grew up with it, you know the place without being told. The wall of strategy guides, the demo kiosk you'd hawk until somebody made you leave, the midnight launch you talked your parents into driving you to, standing in a line, in the cold, for a box you could have bought the next morning. The clerk behind the counter who actually knew what he was talking about and would steer you off the bad purchase. For a whole generation of Canadian kids, that storefront wasn't a retailer. It was a destination. But the thing that actually made these stores money wasn't anything you could see on a shelf. It was a quiet machine humming at the counter, and it only kept working as long as one thing stayed true. You bought a game new, played it through, and brought the disc back for store credit. The store put that used copy straight back on the shelf at a slight discount and pocketed a margin many times richer than it ever made on a new release. A brand new title earns a retailer almost nothing, just thin single digits. A traded-in used game could earn back something closer to half its price. So every disc that came back across the counter turned the store into a little factory, manufacturing its own high-margin inventory out of the games you were finished with. That was the machine, underneath the nostalgia. And that was the brand GameStop bought in 2005. Not just the stores and the shelves, but 2.5 decades of accumulated goodwill built inside Canadian suburbs. In October of 2005, EB Games' biggest rival, an American chain called GameStop, bought it outright. $1.44 billion, near enough. These were the two giants of the same business, the two biggest specialist game retailers on the continent, circling each other for years in the same malls. And then one simply swallowed the other. Overnight, the rivalry was over, and between them, they controlled more than 3,000 stores, a near total grip on physical game retail. And down in the United States, the new owner did exactly what new owners tend to do. It erased the name. Every EB Games in America became a GameStop. The old brand wiped off the map almost overnight. To the people running it, that made perfect sense. Why keep two names when you can have one cleaner, cheaper logo? But not up here. North of the border, GameStop ran into something it hadn't planned for. Its own market research said it in writing. The EB Games name was worth more to Canadian customers than the GameStop name ever would be. So they kept it. For 16 years, the Canadian stores quietly flew the red and white flag while the systems behind the counter shifted to match the American parent. The same held true in Australia. The Americans owned the company on paper. The local sign stayed exactly as it was. That decision wasn't sentiment. It was a calculation, backed by their own data. Which is exactly why what they did next is so hard to explain. Because in 2021, they forgot their own homework. And to understand that year, you have to remember what else was happening to GameStop. In January of 2021, an army of retail investors on Reddit turned GameStop stock into the most talked about ticker on Earth. Its share price spiking to nearly $483 on January 28th, briefly worth more on paper than companies with actual functioning futures. The short sellers who'd bet against it got crushed, and GameStop walked away with something it hadn't had in years: cash. Here's the part most coverage of this story completely misses. That meme stock windfall didn't save the Canadian stores. It funded the decision that damaged them. The new leadership team that took over on the back of that cash walked in with a mandate to standardize everything, globally, immediately. One logo, one name, one brand identity from Texas to Toronto. So that same year, GameStop announced that every Canadian EB Game store would be rebranded to GameStop. Decades of local history ended in a single press release. The reaction was immediate, and it was furious, because that red and white word mark wasn't just branding, it was the color of 1,000 Saturday afternoons. The thing you looked for the second you walked into the mall. Painting over it with a foreign logo didn't feel like a corporate refresh, it felt like somebody quietly editing your own childhood to make their spreadsheet line up. And the financial insult sat right underneath the emotional one. GameStop had measured the exact value of that name back in 2005, and then in 2021, the same company wrote it down to zero, because it was inconvenient for a global standardization chart. And it threw that value away at the worst possible moment, right as the ground underneath every game store on Earth was caving in. Because by the 2020s, the entire reason a store like this existed was evaporating. By 2024, digital downloads were about 95% of all game spending on the planet. And even on consoles, the last holdout for the disc, physical had slipped to roughly 1 in 6 sales. You didn't drive to a mall for a disc anymore. You tapped a button on the couch and the game appeared, downloading while you made dinner. The consoles themselves started shipping with no disc slot at all, and the trade-in counter, that little high-margin factory, lost its fuel completely. Because you cannot trade in a download, there's nothing to hand across the counter. The machine had nothing left to make. But here's the piece the head office in Texas never properly priced in. Running a national chain in Canada costs far more than running the same chain in the United States. And the reason isn't policy, it's the map. Canada has roughly 1/9 of the American population, spread across a country that's actually larger. A distribution network tuned for the dense, short-haul American Sunbelt bleeds money the second you run it across 2,000 kilometers of shield and prairie. Freight from a warehouse in Ontario over the Rockies to British Columbia costs a fortune against what a store out there brings in. Add higher provincial wages and property taxes that swing from province to province, and the math turns brutal before a single customer walks in. Call it the Northern Tax. Target is the textbook case. It walked into Canada in 2013 on the same playbook that had made it one of America's most successful retailers, assuming what worked in Minnesota would work in Manitoba. It burned through roughly 2 billion Canadian dollars in under 2 years, filed for creditor protection in January 2015, and closed all 133 stores. Gone. Not because the brand was bad, because the logistics math never worked, and the model that printed money in the States simply did not survive the border. So when the category collapsed and the Northern Tax kept grinding, GameStop did the cold corporate thing. And look at the scale of the retreat. A decade ago, the company ran around 6,000 stores worldwide. By the start of 2025, it was down to roughly 2,300 in the United States alone, having shuttered nearly 600 of them in 2024 by itself. It started backing out of the whole world. It closed its stores in Austria, Ireland, and Switzerland, then Germany, then sold off Italy. It wound down New Zealand, and by early 2025, it made Canada official. It was looking to offload all of it. And then the CEO said the one thing that turned a quiet business exit into a national insult. Ryan Cohen went online and blamed high taxes and, his words, wokeness and DEI for why GameStop was walking away from Canada and France. A Texas boardroom didn't just leave, it left while telling the country it was the country's own fault. To the couple of hundred Canadian stores and the thousands of people working in them, the message couldn't have been clearer. The parent was done, and the lights were going to be switched off by somebody else. Somebody else walked straight in, and he wasn't a retail giant or a private equity raider. He was, of all things, a toy guy from Quebec. And the way he planned to drag a dead video game chain back to life had almost nothing to do with video games. On May the 5th, 2025, the deal closed. GameStop sold its entire Canadian company to a French-Canadian entrepreneur named Stéphane Tétrault, a name almost nobody outside the toy business knew. They should have, because back in 1998, Tétrault had founded a Quebec company called Imports Dragon out of Bois-Brillant and turned it into one of the largest specialty distribution networks in the country. The company that physically moves licensed product for franchises like the NHL, DC, and Harry Potter across Canada. On top of that, he's a co-owner of McFarlane Toys, the premium collectibles maker founded back in 1994 by Spawn creator Todd McFarlane, the highly detailed, limited-run figures that adult collectors actually hunt for. This was a man whose entire career was built on the one kind of product a download can never be, a physical thing you want to hold. And he'd already shown his hand. Just weeks earlier, he'd stepped in to back another Canadian struggling chain, McFarlane Toys. So when EB Games came up for grabs, this wasn't a wild bet from a stranger. It was the second Canadian retail brand in a matter of weeks that the same Quebec operator decided was worth saving rather than letting die. He bought all of it. The couple of hundred remaining stores, the company itself, lock, stock, and barrel. And his first move was the one thing the Americans never understood was worth doing. He put the old name back. Every store would return to EB Games Canada. The red and the white screwed back onto the door, store by store, over about 6 months. His own words when the deal closed: "This isn't just a business decision. It's about bringing something back that Canadians truly loved." Step back and look at what just happened. A Texas boardroom bought the brand, erased the name, blamed the country, and walked. A guy from Quebec bought it back and made restoring that sign his very first act, every store, coast to coast. And here's the divergence in plain numbers. In the same stretch, the American parent was closing 600 stores a year and writing whole countries off the map. The Canadian operation did the exact opposite. It switched about 200 stores back on, under the name the Americans had buried. One company was subtracting, the other was adding. The press called it going full circle. To a lot of Canadians, it felt like getting back something they'd quietly assumed was gone for good. But nostalgia doesn't pay a lease, and this is where Tétrault's reinvention turns out to be the genuinely smart part. A store that can't survive on selling discs has to stop being a disc store. So the new EB Games tilts its shelves toward the one category that's structurally immune to downloading, because it cannot be downloaded. The limited-run figure, the trading card people line up for on release day, the pop culture piece that gets more valuable, not less, the harder it is to find. You cannot pirate a sealed figure. You cannot torrent a rare card. And buried inside that pivot is the one advantage that makes the new EB Games almost impossible to compete with. And it has nothing to do with what's on the shelves, and everything to do with who owns the trucks that bring them. Economists have a name for what he's built: vertical integration. He owns the chain end to end, the manufacturing, the distribution, and now the stores. Most retailers sit at only one end of it. They buy from a supplier, mark it up, and sell it, taking whatever margin is left after the supplier's cut. In collectibles, where demand spikes fast and stock is limited, that middleman position is brutal. Tétrault doesn't have it. He doesn't negotiate with a distributor for the hot figure because Imports Dragon, his own company, already is the Canadian distributor for those lines, running the logistics for franchises like DC, the NHL, and Harry Potter out of a single 100,000 square foot warehouse north of Montreal. And McFarlane Toys, which he co-owns, manufactures the premium pieces at the top of the collector market. So instead of a store begging a supplier for stock at whatever price it's quoted, the new EB Games plugs straight into a supply network he spent 25 years building. The middleman that squeezes every competing shop just isn't there. No rival can clone that by signing a wholesale account. You'd have to build the whole pipeline from scratch.
And the room itself is being rebuilt around the same idea. Layouts designed to make you stay rather than rush you through. Gaming lounges in the busy locations. In-store events meant to bring back the midnight launch feeling that the download era quietly deleted. Because you can download a game in 30 seconds, at home in your pajamas without talking to a soul. What you cannot download is the feeling of walking into a room full of the stuff you love, run by people who love it too. The disc was always the replaceable part. The room never was. So strip the corporate back and forth away, and here's what you're left with. A category nearly everyone had written off didn't die. It got handed to someone who actually cared about it, and he kept it alive by leaning into the one thing a download can never replicate. A real place full of real people that feels like it's yours. The Americans saw a line item on a balance sheet and a reason to blame the country. A Canadian saw a clubhouse worth keeping the lights on for. They were sure the business was the software. Tétrault bought it back because he understood the business was always the room. So what happens next? Be honest about the math. As a place that just sells you a disc, the game store is finished. About 95% of the spending is already left for the download, and that number only climbs. But that isn't the bet EB Games is making anymore. The bet is that the people who still want the physical thing, plus the collectors, plus everyone who wants a room to walk into, add up to a real defensible business, as long as you own the supply chain feeding it. The winners in the next chapter won't be the chains with the most shelves. They'll be the ones who turn the store into the one thing a download can't be, somewhere you actually go. Whether a couple of hundred Canadian storefronts is enough to prove that, we'll know inside a few years. So I want to hear it straight from you on this one. Is EB Games coming back a genuine Canadian win? Proof that the right owner with the right instincts can drag a so-called dead store all the way back to life? Or is it just a nostalgia trip with a clock ticking on it? A beloved brand on borrowed time until the next wave of downloads takes away the last good reason to walk through the door? Pick one, and tell me why you landed there, and give me the memory while you're at it. Because everyone who grew up here has one. The game you traded in and instantly, painfully regretted the second you got home. The midnight launch you lined up for out in the cold just to be first. The clerk who talked you out of the wrong game and into the right one. Drop it down in the comments. I read them. All of them. Hold on to the things you can't download. Because EB Games got a savior. It got a second act. But next time, we're walking into another Canadian store. One that sold you that very same future, off that very same kind of shelf. The place you bought your first big television, your first laptop, your first armful of DVDs to take home. A homegrown name that ran headfirst into an American giant of its own. Except this story doesn't get the happy ending. This one got picked apart from the inside, piece by piece, by the very company that was supposed to save it. Until then, stay sharp